quick little thought experiment. Assume that you couldn't express yourself in words. How would somebody know how you are feeling at that given moment? Is it through your body language? Is it through eye contact? Is it through your posture? How could you tell what is going on internally for that person if all you could see was what is happening externally? Well, that's what we're going to consider in this lesson, and it's based around this one short sentence, which is movement is the language of the body. And this idea comes from this incredible book called Pleasure by Alexander Lowen. And I'm going to break this down in a number of ways to make it as practical as possible for you, not to just list a series of abstract ideas. So we're going to look at four things mainly. First of all, the pain to pleasure spectrum. The second part is going to be the quality of movement in the body is a better representation of what is actually going on for the person, rather than relying on their words. Part 3 is going to be how to begin feeling more fully alive if you're struggling with a feeling of disconnection from your body. And number 4 is going to be about why willpower is basically irrelevant in this process. So, we've got so much to cover and so little time, so let's actually just get on with it. So what I'm going to do is, for the descriptions of this spectrum, I'm going to be using the wording of pages 55 and 56 quite closely if you do decide to get this book, just to take this further. So in case you're wondering, that's what I'm going to be referencing. So first of all, we have got agony. So agony is referred to as a painful condition beyond the tolerance of the organism. So agony physically manifests as the body twisting and contorting to convulsive movements. And from there, we have pain. So pain is not quite as severe as agony. There is still a disturbance, but it hasn't exceeded the body's tolerance. Directly quoted from the book, in agony, the integrity of the organism is at stake, but in pain, it is only threatened. So the threat is a matter of degree between agony and pain. The next one along is going to be distress. So this is a milder form of more of a painful agitation. So physically, the body might wriggle or squirm because it's uncomfortable, but it isn't the violent twisting and convulsing from the other two. And then that gives way to what Alexander Lowen just simply calls good feelings. So the next level along is just referring to this state of ease and relaxation. So on a physical level, that might mean quiet and more harmonious movements. And from there, we get to pleasure. So as the excitement builds up from these good feelings, we move into a genuinely pleasurable state. I absolutely love the phrasing that Lowen uses because he says that it can be said that the body purrs with pleasure. And I love that really poetic wording of purring. But what that means practically is that the person typically feels soft and vibrant, and their eyes of the person seem brighter. The body moves more freely and openly and intensely. But there is still a coordination and a rhythm, unlike the random and the chaotic nature of convulsing, like we saw a little bit lower on the spectrum. And then from here, pleasure gives way to joy. I'm running out of room a little bit on this. So pleasure gives way to joy, and this is simply just an increased and more intense version of the pleasure. Again, on a practical physical level, this just means that the movements of the person are a bit more lively and a bit more graceful. And at the far end of the spectrum, we end up with ecstasy. So that is going to be what Lowen considers the highest form of pleasurable excitement. The currents in the energy that pass through the body are so strong that the person appears to be lit up. So again, there might be some convulsive elements to these movements, but the pleasure is so strong, because the pleasure is so strong, but these convulsive movements are more unified and rhythmic. So the whole body is moving in unison rather than specific parts moving against other parts of the body, like we saw at the other end of the spectrum. So by putting the feelings on a spectrum like this, we can more easily identify where we are at any given moment. And as a general rule, in painful states, the body moves in a more uncoordinated and spasmodic way, whereas in pleasure, the movements are smoother and more rhythmical. Again, using both those terms there to quote Lowen. And this leads to this wonderfully enlightening point that I mentioned earlier on, that movement is the language of the body. So, if we're ever unsure about how we're feeling, rather than putting the pressure on the words that we are relying on saying to describe ourselves, on the feelings of our inner state, we can simply instead check on the movements of our body for a more accurate reading. So when I'm presented with a situation, am I more rigid and locked in place, or do I move more freely? What is it that I can see rather than what I have to say? So imagine just for a second that you are sat in a circle with a group of 15 other people and you're expected to share for 5 minutes just a recap of your basic week, the previous week. If you imagine yourself in that moment, how do you physically show up? Would you be counting down the amount of people before it gets to your turn to speak and increase the pressure that you put yourself under? If so, what is your body physically doing in that moment? What is your breathing like? Your eye contact? Are your muscles relaxed or are they rigid? Do you feel a certain tightness in a certain part of your body? It's unlikely that you're going to be feeling agony in that moment, but you might legitimately be in distress. And it might feel uncomfortable to recognize that distress, but it means that you can much more easily locate yourself on that spectrum and look to move up by just one step to good feelings. You're not looking to make enormous progress and absolutely love this moment of speaking. Maybe you'll get to that point in the future, but for now, we're just moving up one step. We're just looking to try to move to a state of ease. So when you find yourself in a moment like that, just simply move your arms and move your legs or your head or whatever feels appropriate. And as you do that, notice the quality of your movement. Does it feel natural and flowing, or does it feel more forced and restrictive in some way? The more technical way of saying something like this is, from a subjective sense, your experience of pleasure versus pain is shown in the quality of the body's motility. So motility just refers to the ability of the body to move spontaneously. The pleasure that the body is able to feel results from the satisfaction of the basic needs. So when you feel in need of something, a state of tension is going to be created, and then that gets discharged once that need is met and satisfied. In everyday language, there's going to be a pleasurable feeling of relief. So if we go back to that example of the circle of people, it's about noticing where you are storing that tension in your body, checking the motility of that particular area, and trying to see if you can allow that feeling or any feeling of that part of your body to become much more natural and at ease, rather than just unconsciously rigid. And that's why on a wider scale, you can do something which is physically exhausted and it feel extremely rewarding, like running or sprinting or weightlifting or swimming or cycling, anything. This is learning how to voluntarily build the tension, so increasing the potential excitation, and then releasing that tension by satisfying it and by freeing it. And if you identified earlier on with feeling a lot more rigid rather than spontaneous in terms of movements, then having a physical practice in place can be massively beneficial. Even if it's just going for walks and hikes, it doesn't have to be anything major. By learning how to voluntarily build and release this tension, you come to feel over time not only more in control over your body, but more in line with it and more connected to it. It might feel a little bit like this at first, very artificial, like you are essentially reanimating yourself. But over time, it'll become a habit and you'll feel much more like this, moving much more freely, like this dog that's having a great time over here, just having a run around. So there's an increase in well-being because the pleasure that the body feels is connected to the satisfaction of the needs being met and the tension being released, which is reassuring on a very physical level because in essence, what we're saying is, okay, we've maintained a sense of integrity here. We saw a threat, we got excited and we prepared to act, and we managed the situation. So we can calm down now. We're still in one piece and life is good. So on a personal level, I don't mind sharing that I really struggled with something like this in my teens and my early 20s. So if I just draw this out on a piece of paper, it might make it a little bit easier to show you what I'm talking about. So I lived essentially, if we put this as a 10 up here and a 0 down here, I lived at a chronic 5 out of 10 level. Not feeling particularly good or bad and being very shut off from my body and any feelings associated with it. So what has helped me is rather than assuming 5 out of 10 to be completely neutral as a state, I'm assuming that I'm always going to be either a 4.9 or a 5.1 out of 10. So my assumption is that perfect equilibrium in the body is never going to happen. So I'm always going to be tilting towards the pleasure end of the spectrum or towards the pain end, even if it's just to a small degree. And it was then a process of learning how to access 5.5s and 4.5s out of 10, and then 6s, and then 4s, and then 7s, and then 3s, and so on, up until I get to the point where I can experience basically the full spectrum. So the more I felt in touch with my body, the less mechanically I moved, and the more freely and creatively I was able to express myself. And that had a huge impact on me emotionally and mentally, as well as physically. That meant that although I opened myself to more potential difficulties and difficult emotions, i.e. pain, I also opened myself up to higher possibilities and the moments of being surprised about how good I could feel, i.e. pleasure. So you can't just have pleasure without the possibility of pain, because they're coupled together as possibilities. The feelings of 9 out of 10 open up the doorways to 1 out of 10. But the great news is that feelings of 1 out of 10 open up the doorways to 9s out of 10. So being truly and fully alive is feeling fully alive. And that is expressed through the movements of the body. And returning viewers to this channel can probably see how this links to other ideas that I've already discussed. So living a physically nourishing life is part of the wider plan of living a rewarding life. And that's why I recommended that book, and I do recommend that book frequently, very often, Creating a Life. I'll leave a link below to a deep dive that I've done on building psychological maturity, because we need to be able to hold feelings of anxiety, ambivalence, and ambiguity in mind, but not letting them stop us from building momentum and halting the progress of moving towards our goals. That is just the mental equivalent of this lesson. How do you go from interpreting these blocks as painful states to potentially rewarding states of good feelings, towards eventually moving towards a state of ease, through to these blocks essentially being irrelevant, because the process of building and releasing the psychological tension is rewarding in and of itself. It's exactly why I talk about Abraham Maslow so often as well. So meeting and satisfying our needs unlocks the next level of the need above it, from basic physiological needs through to self-actualization and self-transcendence. There's tension at every level at all times, so we need to stop seeing tension as a problem and more of a signal that we're actually on the right path. It becomes easier to reframe this as, am I moving towards growth or towards safety? Or on a more technical level, am I practicing being values or deficiency values, if you're a fan of his terminology? But in any case, we can simplify this down by quoting Alexander Lowen to this lovely little sentence. An increase of excitation leads to joy and pleasure, and a decrease leads to boredom and pain. And notice how in all of this, I haven't mentioned anything to do with willpower. So the motility of the body is an unconscious process. It's a true representation of what the person is truly feeling. Like I was saying before, movement is the language of the body. There is definitely a time to use willpower and have the ego take conscious control over our actions, but this is typically done for a specific reason and at the expense of the environment of the current situation. So the more willpower is needed, the more conscious control is required to move the musculature of the body. And Lowen actually goes as far as to say that the will is antithetical to pleasure. So we actually use as a short example of a horse rider, which I'll quote here just as we come to a bit of a close for this lesson. I don't actually have a picture of a horse with a rider on it, so you're going to have to make do with this little boy on a dog. So the quote is this: faced with an emergency, the rider takes full control over the horse, which can then be pushed beyond its natural limits. But in this situation, the pleasure of riding is gone for both the horseman and his horse. And it's an interesting thought, because so many of us pride ourselves on our ego and our achievements, our discipline, our routines, our efficiency, and other similar ideas. But perhaps this could become its own defense mechanism if it becomes a default state in the long run, and maybe not something to be proud of. So I'm going to leave this lesson with this confronting thought from page 61, which is just down here if you'd like to follow it along. We do not live to produce. We produce in order to live. A preoccupation with goals and achievement characterizes people who are afraid of pleasure. Now, I'm not going to defend this statement here, but it's something that I'm going to go away and think about beyond this lesson. And I'd love to know what your thoughts are on a confronting and very high level statement like this. So personally, I love being challenged by a statement like this because it forces me to think. So for me, that's my personal homework beyond this at the end of this video. But I just want to do a quick little recap of this video as a summary because we've covered quite a lot in just about 15 minutes there. So first of all, become familiar with this pain to pleasure spectrum, from agony through to ecstasy. And also, rather than relying on your words to justify or express how you're feeling, try trusting the movement of the body instead. So broadly speaking, is it more rigid or is it more fluid in a particular scenario? And consider this idea that movement is the language of the body. I think we're on point 4 here as a summary. So point 4, what physical practices could you put in place where you can voluntarily build up the excitation of your body, building up that tension only to then release it? So the more often that you can practice doing something like this, the greater the feeling of satisfaction and well-being you're likely to experience. And as always, consider buying this book. So all of this comes from just a few pages of this absolute masterpiece by Alexander Lowen, and it is simply just called Pleasure. This is probably a top 10 book for me in my library so far, just for the absolutely enormous positive impact it has had on my life. So I really, really do highly recommend it. All right, I'm leaving that one there. We've covered quite a lot, so I will see you in a future lesson. See you then.